Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am Dr. Mira Mosini. I'm a senior researcher at the Coalition of Communities of Color. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Andres Lopez, our research director, and we're here to go through our recently launched and released report called Cultivating Belonging in Clackamas County, a Research Justice Study. This is going to be an overview for y'all of the various chapters in the report. And this video is meant to accompany the report, and we'll have a link for y'all to download it as well at the end of the presentation. I wanted to start with making some acknowledgements. We begin our report with acknowledging the land, the people, and community desires. So starting with the land, we honor the Native American people of Clackamas County as a vibrant, foundational, and integral part of our community here today. We respectfully acknowledge Wai'ist, also known as Mount Hood, and Hias T. Tumwada, also known as Willamette Falls, as sacred sites for many Native Americans. We thank those who have connection to this land and serve as stewards, working to ensure our ecosystem stays balanced and healthy. Acknowledging the original people of the land is a simple, powerful practice that demonstrates respect by making Indigenous peoples' history and culture visible. It's also a small step along the path towards reconciliation and repair. So please join us in taking this opportunity to thank and honor the original caretakers of this land. We dedicate the report to Clackamas County community members who fought so hard for this report to be actualized and taken seriously, along with all voices from the community. Many leaders from communities of color across the county and various jurisdictions championed this research. We want to acknowledge the 10 adult and 5 5 members of the youth steering committee who spent over a year with us, working to develop research questions, data collection processes, engaging with community, analyzing the data, and creating our calls to action. We also want to acknowledge the formerly operating Equity and Inclusion Office at Clackamas County. Throughout the research, the team there supported us so thoughtfully, demonstrating their expertise in meaningfully connecting and collaborating with communities of color. And lastly, we want to acknowledge the many, many equity leaders and supporters throughout the county, working in a host of organizations, coalitions, jurisdictions, and sectors. And finally, we want to acknowledge community desires. We want to acknowledge all of the county residents and workers who took the time to speak with us, to share data, to tell us their concerns, their experiences, and the desires for the future of Clackamas County. We engaged with over 400 residents and workers throughout this process, and it's been an honor to hear your truths and desires for the future. Okay, we're going to start overviewing the 7 chapters of this report. Chapter 1 is an introduction to the study. It's how we approached it, who was a part of it, and what it took to get it done. It ends with a section called The Power of Qualitative Data, and we really encourage y'all to read it, because to do this type of study in a way that's robust, that's rigorous, and that's with integrity requires that we rely heavily on the power of qualitative data, of stories and narratives and words, and treat these narratives and stories as reliable and trustworthy evidence for decision making. So for the overview of this chapter, we start with discussing what it took to get it done, followed by a brief explanation of research justice and the approach we took in this study. All right, so on page 11 of the report, you'll find this image of a timeline. This goes through the very beginning of this report. The process of doing this research started back in January 2020, when we presented the idea to the commission, and the research justice study was sort of launched in a preliminary way, which is to say that we agreed to do an environmental scan of community-based organizations and other kinds of folks who were organizing throughout the county to think about what does equity, diversity, equity, inclusion mean and look like across the county. So that was in May, sort of 2020 till the end of 2020. We published our environmental scan towards the end of 2020. And then our research justice study launched in the following year. We did a lot of relationship building. We met with a lot of folks who shared data with us. We call them data actors. We did a lot of meetings with folks like school administrators, elected officials, community organizers, community-based organizations, et cetera. So a lot of this, the first stages of this work was relationship building. We then reached out to folks who would be part of our steering committee. We met with our steering committee for over a year, up until about 18 months. And we worked with our steering committee members to develop our questions that guided the research. And they were really at the forefront of collecting a lot of the data that you'll find throughout the report. And then we worked with our steering committee to construct the calls to action, which you'll find at the end of the report. And then finally, the report was launched in 2024, earlier this year in September. And so overall, this is a culmination of over 4 years of working closely with folks in Clackamas County across the many geographies that constitute the county. And we're really proud to share this with you. So what did it take to get it done? Well, this is a research justice study, and that means something specific. So we wanted to highlight sort of the core components or the elements of research justice. So first is that underrepresented and marginalized communities are the experts of their lived experiences and have the strategies and solutions to ensure the well-being of their communities and environments. The next element of research justice is that there are diverse ways of knowing, and these are elevated. So stories, narratives, and other culturally relevant modes of expression are valid and valuable ways of transmitting information across space and time. Research justice studies aim to elevate these diverse ways of knowing and sharing truths as important evidence for decision-making. Thirdly, communities lead the research. So communities lead the projects, not the researchers. To accomplish this, we, the researchers, must build relationships with community members to establish trust and understand how to create processes where community members' truths can be captured and shared responsibly and thoughtfully. And lastly, calls to action. Research findings must be in the service of improving the lives of those most impacted by oppression and transforming systems so that they don't reproduce oppression. So research findings must be translated into clear calls to action that are vetted by and representative of the community truths and their desires. All right. Chapter 2 is called Leading with Belonging, and this study is fundamentally, and this chapter reinforces the real core of this study, which is about belonging. Throughout our work with community members in Clackamas County, it became really clear that belonging was at the heart of what many people of color shared with us, right? A desire to live in a place where they felt connected, where they could thrive and build community. Additionally, as we built relationships with people working in dominant institutions in Clackamas County, like government agencies, health systems, et cetera, we observed that belonging was articulated as really important for doing equity and inclusion work. So we knew that this concept of belonging had to be a sort of a guiding framework and principle. So in the report, we talk about how belonging has been defined, measured, and used across the breadth of academic scholarship. And then we share how us going through this research justice process over the last 4 years led us to coming up with our own understanding and our own frameworks for belonging. So we share those as well. So let's move on to talking about our 2 frameworks for belonging. So first we talk about the dual belonging framework. This was a framework that was co-constructed with steering committee members and vetted with other project partners throughout the course of this 4-year process. The framework guided our research by distinguishing between what kinds of data collection should be community-led in order to understand desires for belonging, and then what topics of data collection should be done in partnership with the dominant in order to understand how equity and inclusion strategies can foster belonging. So this dual belonging framework assumes that there are some efforts that the dominant should lead, while there are others that should be led by community. In other words, both the dominant and community approaches are needed to create the conditions for belonging in Clackamas County. While different belonging efforts are led by different groups, community or dominant, it's really important that collaboration between the two happens. So the next framework that we include in this chapter is called the Belonging Assessment Framework. And this really is about providing some guidance for how to understand belonging, but really also how to operationalize it, because this can be often like a really challenging part of like measuring and operationalizing this concept of belonging. But in this framework, we try to provide some of that guidance. So how do we track, assess, and be transparent about how belonging could advance certain equity outcomes? So we have this 3-part framework. So we first think about B, right? Accounting for present realities and needs. And we propose tracking things like who are Clackamas County residents? What social, cultural, linguistic, and other needs do they have? What are the barriers and challenges they face in meeting those needs? So it's really providing these guiding questions for how to track and assess people's current realities. The second part, longing, right? Accounting for future desire. So what are the desires of Clackamas County residents? What do they want changed or improved? What does thriving and being cared for mean for them? So a lot of the ways in which we would track these future desires is by collecting and using qualitative data, by funding and supporting community-led needs assessment, et cetera. And so when you put be and longing together, you have, the implementation of belonging, right? So how do you implement these two parts, be and longing, into decision-making processes to affect change? In other words, how can existing decision-making processes accommodate what's known from be and longing, what's known from our understanding of present realities and desires for the future? So we could, in terms of implementing belonging, we could build and update a registry of community engagement data. We can create transparency around what are the current realities and future desires, and we could communicate and get feedback on approaches that address them. Ultimately, this framework is a guide for understanding what conditions are needed for community members to be themselves and also have their desires for the future taken seriously. All right, I will pass it over to Andres to talk about chapter 3.
Thanks, Mira. So in chapter 3, which was called Clackamas County Context, we really set out to provide a backdrop for sort of how we came to understand this very large county, and how we sort of thought of it from a spatial or geographic perspective, as well as along the lines of race and ethnicity and language and other demographic realities. So in this chapter, you're going to see a lot more numbers and tables and other representations, quantitative representations that help understand what is Clackamas County and what does it currently look like. So just to offer a few examples, one of the things that was important to us from the beginning of the project was really identifying the fact that Clackamas County is um, urban, suburban, rural, and wild. And you can sort of see these geographic differences represented in this map here on the slide. And we also provided some data by those geographies to really sort of help folks understand just really how diverse the county is in all the ways that I had mentioned, right? In geography and race and ethnicity and in language. So we also provided other data that helped better contextualize these realities, like I said, around language use across the different spatial areas, as well as other data around housing and around food systems and also transportation. So you can really spend some time in this chapter getting better acquainted quantitatively about how you can think about Clackamas County or understand the county. And that was really important for us to provide that sort of context, since the majority of this research report is qualitative. It is about the words and the meanings and the desires of community members. Okay, so in chapter 4, which was titled Whiteness, Race, and Racialization, and Attempts to Address Racism in the United States. This chapter really tried to help, was really important for us to write as well, because we really wanted to provide some baseline understanding of some of these areas. So I'm going to talk briefly about the 4 main areas in this section. And really the point of this was to help the reader have a better sense of these big concepts, but really, again, that baseline so that we can think about how to really address belonging and the racial inequities that sort of get in the way of that. So first, in chapter 2, as Mira described, we started with this concept of belonging to sort of lead the vision of the research and the method and how we would do it, or what would guide the research. And then in chapter 3, we presented that data that really demonstrated the depth of inequality, the quantitative representations of inequalities that we were up against. So for this chapter, we really wanted to provide that shared understanding of terms and histories and approaches to addressing racism. So folks had a sense of how to enter into this discussion, how to move forward with what community was saying they wanted next, based off of some understanding of what we've came from. So we began with perceptions of belonging and othering in the United States. And really that section is about what does belonging look like for different racial and ethnic groups historically in the United States? And how often did those distinctive groups in the pursuit of belonging actually experience a process called othering, right? Where they were set aside not as folks who belonged in the US, but as others. So we provide a little bit of language and understanding and some data to make the case of these perceptions of belonging and othering. And the next part, we talk about whiteness. We really wanted to provide a shared historical research on how whiteness was created in the United States. A lot of folks don't know this history, but there's a lot of scholars who have well documented the process in which different racial and ethnic groups experienced this process of whiteness when they entered the United States, right? Where these racial indicators did not exist in the same way in their home countries, but in the United States, there was sort of this process of having to confront whether or not you were white or you weren't. And so we spent some time talking about that process in that section, which is really critical for understanding currently how race operates in the United States. This next part, we talked about race and racialization. We really wanted to be clear that race is and is not real, right? It is made up, and it also that in the way that it's made up has had serious consequences for people historically and also still baked into our current systems and organizations. So we really wanted to provide a distinction of this category of race, where it came from, the impact that label has had, and then as well as start describing racialization as really a process in which race gets applied to certain groups in certain contexts under certain conditions, right? So that racialization is the process in which race is made real and material in our society. So we try to describe a little bit about that to help folks understand how these two things operate. And then lastly, in this section, we really wanted to talk about attempts to address racism, right? So if race is essentially not real, but we made it up and it's had real consequences, how do we unmake it, right? How do we address it, right? How do we change it? So we provide a little bit of history here about how we've attempted to do that in the past in the United States, and what that has transpired and what that's looked like currently today. All right, I'll pass it back to you, Mira.
All right, thank you. All right, in chapter 5, we really do a little bit of a deep dive into the histories and connections that communities of color or Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC folks have to Clackamas County. And this is really an extension of chapter 4 that Andres just talked about, in the sense that we try to historically contextualize processes of othering, white histories of whiteness, histories of race and racialization in the Clackamas County historical context. Um, and we really try to address three key questions here, right? What histories are not being told? What are the implications of this erasure? And what can be done to make these histories more visible? And we take these guiding questions and apply them to essentially 4 historical case studies. So the first one is looking at Indigenous histories. And before I move on, actually, I just want to caveat this overview of this chapter by saying we are not historians. Um, this is our very humble attempt to write history, some of which are better documented than others, of people of color, as far as we could gather. And those histories within Clackamas County. I mean, some of the histories, because there is such little documentation specific to Clackamas County, we've had to broaden out to talk about Oregon. But as best as we could do, we try to connect these communities' histories to Clackamas County. So Indigenous histories, for example, we're really wanting to connect Indigenous, various Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations' connection to Willamette Falls, and really think deeply about the meaning of what it means to be connected to a place from time immemorial. So we have a little bit of a discussion about what that means, and then we go on to talk about various different tribal groups' efforts to reclaim their connection and rights to the falls while in the process of navigating colonial systems. Our next historical section is about Black histories. And really, this is about understanding and reconciling with Oregon's history of anti-Blackness and Black exclusion. And we really sort of do a little bit of a dive into the way in which Oregon's Constitution was written. We talk about Black exclusionary laws. We talk about and we profile some important figures in Black history to really humanize the impacts of these racist policies on Black communities in Clackamas County and in Oregon. And then we end that chapter by thinking about what does it look like to recover and reconcile with and memorialize Black history in Clackamas County. The third history that we write is about Chinese histories. And again, we're really wanting to understand anti-Chinese history on the West Coast. It's quite extensive. And then what were the implications of this anti-Chinese history in terms of the violence that Chinese communities faced and how this anti-Chinese history really had implications for the visibility of Chinese communities. They were made often hyper visible and therefore became targets of violence in terms of their safety. And in terms of their resilience, we have, histories of Chinese communities kind of retreating, trying to become less visible for their own safety, and therefore creating quite strong community bonds. We have historical examples of like thriving economies that were kind of existing within these Chinese enclave communities. So we write a little bit about that, and again, we want to humanize this history as much as possible and connect it to Clackamas County as much as possible. So we talk about a little bit about what we could find about the story of Ah Bing, whose name uh, is connected to the Bing cherry, which is so well known, and what we can recover about his story and how the anti-Chinese laws and legislation and exclusionary policies really impacted him uh, because he actually had to leave um, Clackamas County and Oregon because of those policies. And lastly, we talk about Latine histories and really understanding that Latine communities have a very, very long connection to Oregon. And by long, I mean, we're talking about 1700s, 1800s. We're talking about when the border of Mexico butted up right up against the Oregon Territory border. So there was a lot of migration and a lot of connection between particularly Mexicans and folks that were living in the Oregon Territory at the time. And we also want to understand specifically how demands for labor influenced a lot of the migration patterns and patterns of settlement that we see many Latinx communities experience. And we end this chapter by talking about uh, collective efforts within Latinx communities to ensure community rights and safety and the histories of those efforts. What we really want to convey in this chapter is the need to reckon and to recognize, reckon, and reconcile with our past. So for too long, the history of Oregon has been told from the perspective of a very powerful but limited narrative, which is that of the white pioneer. The power and danger of this perspective is that it creates and perpetuates the narrative and belief that the so-called American West was largely an empty place that was civilized by and belongs to the white settler. Um, this is a long, entrenched narrative that needs to be disrupted, and we're seeing many ways in which it is being disruptive, and we hope that our chapter is also considered to be a disruption to this narrative.
Thank you, Mira. So I'm going to talk with you all about our chapter 6, which is our case studies. And the case studies were really at the heart of this research. These are the various engagement efforts that were led by our steering committee members who were most close to certain communities and certain topics. And so these were case studies about real lived experiences, real concerns about what was happening in certain communities and in certain systems and in certain histories. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what that looked like. So as I said, these were really the most meaningful areas of the research for our steering committee members. And you can really see these as the experiences and desires of communities of color throughout the county. So we broke up the case studies into 4 sections, and that was through newly arrived, experiences of immigrants who settle in the county, always been here, experiences of communities that have been here and contributed to the county, the navigation of essential institutions, so how BIPOC adults and youths navigate certain institutions in the county, and then we end with dominant involvement in community belonging. So as Mira mentioned earlier about the dual belonging framework, we really wanted to make sure that we provided guidance to the dominant about how they should be engaging with belonging and how they should be working with community to create these conditions. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about the different case studies here, but we really do hope that you go and read them and spend some time with them because they really are, again, the heart of this research and our steering committee members who led us. So in the first three section of case studies, newly arrived, you will read about memory and migration, voices of Latinx communities in Mount Hood, and you'll get to. So I'm going to pause here. We may need to edit because I think the camera was slowing down.
Oh, okay.
So in the different sections, which I began with the four different sections, there were different case studies that were a part of each section. So for that first set of case studies, newly arrived, there were three different studies in that section. The first one was about memory and migration, so voices of Latinx communities from Mount Hood. And here you'll be able to hear and learn about what it's like to migrate to Clackamas County, to move to the Mount Hood area, to build community, to start employment, to build relationships with those who've already there and have buildings and businesses and power, right? What does it look like to migrate, and what actually helps communities feel more anchored and feel more supported in that process? In the second case study, you'll learn about immigrants seeking employment. One of our steering committee members led this survey of Chinese and Latinx communities and the challenges that they experience with the job search. So you'll get a better sense of what it is when certain immigrants are attempting to seek employment in the county. What do they experience? What would help support them better to be employed, and what skills do they bring with them? The third case study here was about ambition and small business ownership. So in this case study, you'll be able to get a better sense of the power of BIPOC immigrants doing business and building community in Clackamas County, and really how important those small businesses led by BIPOC immigrants are, and the various ways that they work together to fill in service gaps in dominant institutions and to provide essential services that are culturally specific or linguistically specific when appropriate. But you learn a little bit more about ways to help improve those small business ownerships and what are some of the things that these folks want. In the second batch of case studies, in the section we entitled Always Been Here, we begin by exploring conditions for safety. And really this comes from our understanding of, through our engagement of what certain Native communities desire for belonging in Clackamas County. So here you'll get a sense of what does safety look like from the perspective of some of these Indigenous folks living in the county. How do they think about what a safe Clackamas looks like, and what does it take to get there? We'll also learn about Black histories and visibility. So you will hear from in-depth interviews that were taken with Black community members and Black historians in the county that talk about the work that they're trying to do to better visibilize Black folks historically and currently, and what their desires are for the future in Clackamas County. In the third set of case studies here, which we called Navigating Essential Institutions, you will learn about teaching inequity. So what does it take to support English language learners, BIPOC students, and LGBTQ students and families? So we really wanted to get a better sense from teachers who are English language learners or BIPOC folks in our county, and what are their experiences, and how are they trying to better support these students? What's getting in their way, and how can we do things differently to better support students and families throughout the county in educational settings? The next case study was called Amplifying BIPOC Youth Voices. And really, what we heard a lot from the BIPOC youth was their desires for harm reduction in schools, the many ways that they are experiencing racism and homophobia, transphobia, a lot of forms of othering, and really the lack of support and guidance from adults in those contexts. They talk about those experiences, they talk about what needs to shift, and what they would like to see different in their schools. Lastly, in this section of navigating essential institutions, you'll learn about health and wellness from the perspective of Black and Native community members, as well as those working in health systems across the county. And here, again, we get a better understanding of the inequities that folks experience, the challenges and discrimination that they experience in trying to navigate health systems, and ultimately their desires for what would make a health system be more appropriate, more supportive, more welcoming, and really eliminate some of those negative and harmful experiences that they're having. And the last set of case studies, which was about the dominant involvement in community belonging, we focus on two case studies. One was around meaningful community events. So really, what does it take to engage and center BIPOC communities when you're throwing events? And we attended 17 or 18 events across the 4 years in which we did this research. And we took a lot of notes and we interviewed a lot of folks at those events, those who threw it, those who attended it. And really, we aggregate all of those findings and perspectives into some suggestions on how to better throw more meaningful events where community is centered and leading. So that guidance was really critical. And we heard a lot from those who paid for this study, the different jurisdictions, utilities, and governments who wanted to better understand, how to do this differently. The second and last case study in this section was around removing obstacles for community-based organizations. So we spent some time engaging culturally specific and culturally responsive or organizations offering culturally specific and culturally responsive services, and really got a better sense of the struggles they faced with working with the county, with trying to get better contracts, with the struggles they face with serving their communities, and the ways that the county and other dominant institutions could better support CBOs, which are really doing the essential services of providing essential services for communities who are often forgotten, erased, or left behind. So in this case study, you'll learn a lot more about how the county can be more responsive to that. All right, I'll pass it back to you, Mira.
Hey, thanks, Andres. All right, we have reached the last chapter of this report. Chapter 7 is our calls to action. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar or presentation, a research justice study means that we collect and use evidence in order to propose action, to change, to make meaningful and desired changes. And what Andres just went over in terms of the case study, that is powerful, powerful evidence for what are the current realities of BIPOC communities in these various areas of life, migration, health, safety, etc. And what are their desired changes in their lives. And so we worked very closely with our steering committee members, with our other partners and collaborators to develop these calls to action that are grounded in a diversity of evidence, which includes all of the evidence just presented in the case studies, which includes all of the evidence that we collected about the quantitative realities or representations of disparities that you'll find in chapter 3. And this comprehensive aggregation and consideration of data is what really shaped and informed the calls to action that I'm going to show you right now. I also want to mention that we will be also creating a series of shorter videos about each of these calls to action that will begin rolling out in early 2025. So we really want to be intentional about using this report for action. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to create this series of videos that really hones in on each of the calls to action. So look out for those in early 2025. All right. Um, the first calls to action, let me just explain how we've organized these. These are grouped into 7 larger themes, and within each theme, we have a series of calls to action. So the first theme is BIPOC histories and futures. Within this theme, there are 3 calls to action. I've summarized them here, but really, truth-telling about BIPOC histories, addressing legacies of historical injustices, and cross-cultural connections to share histories and desires for the future. These are summaries of the calls to action. And in the report, we provide some recommendations, particularly focused on dominant institutions, on how they can advance or support these calls to action. So an example here is funds for community-based memorialization projects. This is one very tangible, concrete way in which you can tell the truth about BIPOC histories, and really address the legacies of historical injustices by funding efforts, community-based efforts to memorialize BIPOC histories. The next broader area of calls to action is peer-to-peer support systems. Again, 3 calls to action here that are summarized: fund mentorship opportunities, convene BIPOC small businesses to share resources, and fund BIPOC-led networking opportunities. So an example of advancing this type of call to action would be funding mentorship programs focused on navigating government regulations and compliance standards. So this call to action, I'll just give you a little background, was really shared with us when we convened BIPOC small businesses. And there was really a massive barrier for them in navigating a bureaucracy, a bureaucratic system, in navigating all of the various standards and regulations around how to maintain compliance as a small business. So they really articulated this need for much more mentorship from folks within their community or outside their community that had already gone through this, that they shared with us that this would be really, really helpful. The next broad area of calls to action is diverse workplace and leadership. And here we have, again, 3 calls to action: conduct equity audits to understand and mitigate inequities in hiring, retention, and contracting processes, provide culturally specific support for job seekers, recruit and hire diverse leadership. One example of how to support these calls to action is creating public accessible data about employee and contractor demographics, being transparent about to what extent are you using equitable processes and practices around employee retention and hiring and who you contract with. Next, we have community events and resource sharing. So under this, we have another 3 calls to action summarized: leverage space for community building and connection, foster institutional partnerships to support facilitating events, and provide community organizers with technical assistance support. So one example of how to advance This call to action is providing no or low cost spaces for community organizers to use. Next, we have supporting community-based organizations. And under this, we have 3 calls to action. Fund new and existing community-based organizations or CBOs to provide culturally specific services, create coordinated countywide funding strategy, and streamline contracting processes. An example of a tangible way to advance these calls to action is creating a cross-jurisdiction effort to communicate with CBOs about funding opportunities and statewide changes. Just want to sort of give a shout out to, again, and a reminder that these calls to action are connected to all of to all of the data that we've presented prior to this report. So if you want to better understand why this call to action came, I would strongly recommend checking out the case study about community supporting removing barriers for community-based organizations, because in that case study, you will get a lot more of the context that community-based organizations shared with us when we met them throughout the several years we were doing this work. You can get much more of that context and really understand why this call to action came to be in the first place. And this is true for all of the calls to action. The next one is student desires for change. Here we have calls to train administrative staff and teachers on racism and equity, funds for culturally responsive mental health resources for students and staff, and recruitment and retention of BIPOC teacher workforce. Advancing these calls to action could look like collaborating with local anti-racism groups, coalitions, student groups to create and deliver training curriculum. And then lastly, our 7th broad sort of call to action group here is institutional diversity, equity, inclusion, compliance data, and harm reduction. So a summary of these calls to action include build capacity to maintain compliance with federal funding pathways, including Title 2, 6, and 9, collect, track, and publicly share data about population shifts, community needs assessments, and implementation of community feedback, and support harm reduction efforts in the workplace. And one of the loudest examples of how to realize this call to action and many of the other calls to action that we've shared in this chapter is reinstate the Office of Equity and Inclusion at Clackamas County. So we hope you found these chapter overviews helpful. And of course, these are overviews. We definitely encourage you to download the full report if you want to dig deeper into any of the chapters that might have piqued your interest. Here's a QR code that you can use your phone to access the website where you can download the report, or there's a link there. You can go directly to downloading the report from our website. So thank you so very much for being here, for listening to us, for being interested in supporting racial justice efforts in Clackamas County. We need everyone's support and collaboration to do this work. And please, we as an organization are committed to supporting the work of Clackamas County organizing, whether it's in a dominant institution or community-based work. And please check out our website, and we will continue to update our efforts in Clackamas County. Thank you.